Today's story reveals 3 heartbreaking cases of young lives stolen too soon. First, the murder of Billie-Jo Jenkins, a 13-year-old girl whose death at home sparked decades of controversy. Then, Danielle Jones, a teenager betrayed and killed by someone she trusted the most. Finally, Leanne Tiernan, whose tragic death and hidden remains left investigators and a community searching for answers. Let's dive into these haunting cases. It was a chilly February afternoon in 1997 when the peaceful seaside town of Hastings, in East Sussex, England, was shattered by a horrific discovery. The Jenkins family home stood on a quiet residential street, the kind of place where neighbors greeted each other warmly, and the most excitement came from children playing outside after school. But on this day, the home would become the epicenter of a tragedy so shocking it would haunt the community for years to come. Inside the Jenkins household, Billie-Jo Jenkins, a 13-year-old girl with a bright smile and a promising future, was spending her afternoon working on a project in the back garden. She was an artistic child, known for her creativity and love of painting. That day, she had decided to repaint an iron garden bench, a task she took on with enthusiasm despite the biting winter air. Billie-Jo, a foster child in the care of Cyan Jenkins and his family, had found a measure of stability in this home after a turbulent early life. She had dreams of becoming an artist and often lost herself in her work. The sound of her stepfather, Cyan Jenkins, leaving the house with 2 of his daughters echoed faintly as Billie-Jo remained outside, focused on her project. The family had errands to run, leaving her alone for what was supposed to be only a short time. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden, and the rhythmic scrape of her paintbrush against the bench filled the quiet air. It was an ordinary moment, one that would soon be broken in the most unimaginable way. At some point during that quiet afternoon, the ordinary turned into a nightmare. The details of what happened next remained shrouded in mystery, but the outcome was undeniable. When Cyan Jenkins returned home later that day, he found Billie-Jo lying on the patio in a pool of red. Her injuries were catastrophic, and the scene was one of chaos and horror. The once quiet garden now bore the signs of an unimaginable act of violence. Jenkins' cries for help pierced the air as neighbors rushed to the scene, their faces etched with confusion and fear. Emergency services were called, and paramedics arrived swiftly, but it was too late. Billie-Jo's injuries were too severe, and she was pronounced dead at the scene. The garden, once a place of creativity and life, had become a crime scene. The news of Billie-Jo's deaths spread quickly through the tight-knit community, leaving neighbors and friends in shock. How could such a terrible act occur in a town like Hastings, in a home that had seemed so ordinary? Speculation began almost immediately, with whispers of what might have happened and who could have been responsible. But as the investigation unfolded, the answers would prove to be anything but straightforward. The police arrived within hours, sealing off the house and garden as they began their painstaking search for evidence. Officers combed through the scene, their flashlights cutting through the growing darkness as they documented every detail. The bench Billie-Jo had been painting was examined closely, its surface still wet with paint. Investigators noted the proximity of her art supplies, scattered as though dropped in a moment of panic. But the most significant discovery lay in the injuries Billie-Jo had sustained, injuries that suggested a blunt instrument had been used with chilling force. Detectives quickly turned their attention to the residents of the Jenkins household. Cyan Jenkins, Billie-Jo's foster father, became a key figure in the investigation. His account of the day's events was scrutinized, every detail analyzed for inconsistencies. Jenkins claimed he had been out running errands with his daughters and had returned to find Billie-Jo in the garden. But as investigators pieced together the timeline, questions began to emerge. Forensic experts arrived to assist with the investigation, their work critical in uncovering what had transpired. The back garden and surrounding areas were examined for clues, footprints, fingerprints, and any signs of an intruder. One of the first pieces of evidence to raise eyebrows was a series of minute droplets found on Jenkins' clothing. These droplets, invisible to the naked eye but revealed under forensic analysis, would become a focal point in the case. Were they the result of Jenkins discovering Billie-Jo and attempting to help her? Or did they suggest something far more sinister? As the investigation progressed, the focus on Cyan Jenkins intensified. The police conducted interviews with family members, neighbors, and anyone who had interacted with Billie-Jo in the days leading up to her death. What emerged was a portrait of a family under strain. Tensions between Jenkins and his foster daughter were hinted at by some witnesses, while others described him as a strict but caring father. The conflicting accounts only deepened the mystery, casting doubt on what had truly happened that fateful afternoon. Meanwhile, the community grappled with the loss of a young life full of potential. Billie-Jo had been well liked at school, her friends describing her as kind, creative, and full of laughter. Vigils were held in her memory, candles flickering in the cold night, as classmates and teachers mourned her passing. The outpouring of grief was immense, but so too was the demand for answers. Who could have taken the life of such a bright and promising girl? And why? As the weeks turned into months, the case remained in the public eye, fueled by intense media coverage. Speculation swirled around the Jenkins family, with Cyan at the center of the storm. The police, under pressure to solve the case, worked tirelessly to build their narrative, but the evidence was far from conclusive. What had seemed at first like an open and shut case was now revealing layers of complexity and doubt. The discovery of Billie-Jo's body had been the catalyst for a tragedy that would consume not only her family, but also an entire community. It was a case that would test the limits of forensic science, challenge the reliability of eyewitness accounts, and ultimately leave a legacy of unanswered questions. But for now, as the investigation unfolded, one thing was clear: the search for justice had only just begun. It was a chilly February afternoon in 1997 when the peaceful seaside town of Hastings in East Sussex, England, was shattered by a horrific discovery. The Jenkins family home stood on a quiet residential street, the kind of place where neighbors greeted each other warmly, and the most excitement came from children playing outside after school. But on this day, the home would become the epicenter of a tragedy so shocking it would haunt the community for years to come. Inside the Jenkins household, Billie-Jo Jenkins, a 13-year-old girl with a bright smile and a promising future, was spending her afternoon working on a project in the back garden. She was an artistic child, known for her creativity and love of painting. That day, she had decided to repaint an iron garden bench, a task she took on with enthusiasm despite the biting winter air. Billie-Jo, a foster child in the care of Cyan Jenkins and his family, had found a measure of stability in this home after a turbulent early life. She had dreams of becoming an artist and often lost herself in her work. The sound of her stepfather, Cyan Jenkins, leaving the house with two of his daughters echoed faintly as Billie-Jo remained outside, focused on her project. The family had errands to run, leaving her alone for what was supposed to be only a short time. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden, and the rhythmic scrape of her paintbrush against the bench filled the quiet air. It was an ordinary moment, one that would soon be broken in the most unimaginable way. At some point during that quiet afternoon, the ordinary turned into a nightmare. The details of what happened next remained shrouded in mystery, but the outcome was undeniable. When Cyan Jenkins returned home later that day, he found Billie-Jo lying on the patio in a pool of red. Her injuries were catastrophic, and the scene was one of chaos and horror. The once quiet garden now bore the signs of an unimaginable act of violence. Jenkins' cries for help pierced the air as neighbors rushed to the scene, their faces etched with confusion and fear. Emergency services were called and paramedics arrived swiftly, but it was too late. Billie-Jo's injuries were too severe, and she was pronounced dead at the scene. The garden, once a place of creativity and life, had become a crime scene. The news of Billie-Jo's death spread quickly through the tight-knit community, leaving neighbors and friends in shock. How could such a terrible act occur in a town like Hastings, in a home that had seemed so ordinary? Speculation began almost immediately, with whispers of what might have happened and who could have been responsible. But, as the investigation unfolded, the answers would prove to be anything but straightforward. The police arrived within hours, sealing off the house and garden as they began their painstaking search for evidence. Officers combed through the scene, their flashlights cutting through the growing darkness as they documented every detail. The bench Billie-Jo had been painting was examined closely, its surface still wet with paint. Investigators noted the proximity of her art supplies, scattered as though dropped in a moment of panic. But the most significant discovery lay in the injuries Billie-Jo had sustained, injuries that suggested a blunt instrument had been used with chilling force. Detectives quickly turned their attention to the residents of the Jenkins household. Cyan Jenkins, Billie-Jo's foster father, became a key figure in the investigation. His account of the day's events was scrutinized, every detail analyzed for inconsistencies. Jenkins claimed he had been out running errands with his daughters and had returned to find Billie-Jo in the garden. But as investigators pieced together the timeline, questions began to emerge. Forensic experts arrived to assist with the investigation, their work critical in uncovering what had transpired. The back garden and surrounding areas were examined for clues, footprints, fingerprints, and any signs of an intruder. One of the first pieces of evidence to raise eyebrows was a series of minute droplets found on Jenkins' clothing. These droplets, invisible to the naked eye, but revealed under forensic analysis, would become a focal point in the case. Were they the result of Jenkins discovering Billie-Jo and attempting to help her? Or did they suggest something far more sinister? As the investigation progressed, the focus on Sion Jenkins intensified. The police conducted interviews with family members, neighbors, and anyone who had interacted with Billie-Jo in the days leading up to her death. What emerged was a portrait of a family under strain. Tensions between Jenkins and his foster daughter were hinted at by some witnesses, while others described him as a strict but caring father. The conflicting accounts only deepened the mystery, casting doubt on what had truly happened that fateful afternoon. Meanwhile, the community grappled with the loss of a young life full of potential. Billie-Jo had been well liked at school, her friends describing her as kind, creative, and full of laughter. Vigils were held in her memory, candles flickering in the cold night, as classmates and teachers mourned her passing. The outpouring of grief was immense, but so too was the demand for answers. Who could have taken the life of such a bright and promising girl? And why? As the weeks turned into months, the case remained in the public eye, fueled by intense media coverage. Speculation swirled around the Jenkins family, with Sion at the center of the storm. The police, under pressure to solve the case, worked tirelessly to build their narrative, but the evidence was far from conclusive. What had seemed at first like an open and shut case was now revealing layers of complexity and doubt. The discovery of Billie-Jo's body had been the catalyst for a tragedy that would consume not only her family, but also an entire community. It was a case that would test the limits of forensic science, challenge the reliability of eyewitness accounts, and ultimately leave a legacy of unanswered questions. But for now, as the investigation unfolded, one thing was clear: the search for justice had only just begun. As the investigation into Billie-Jo Jenkins' tragic death deepened, the quiet town of Hastings transformed into a hub of police activity and public speculation. The Jenkins family home, once a symbol of stability for Billie-Jo, became the epicenter of a sprawling inquiry. Law enforcement faced mounting pressure to piece together what had happened that fateful afternoon. The case was complex, the evidence was murky, and the stakes were high. Detectives began their work by meticulously reconstructing the timeline of events leading up to Billie-Jo's death. Every movement of the family that day was analyzed, every statement scrutinized for inconsistencies. The first wave of interviews focused on the family members who had been in and out of the house that afternoon. Sion Jenkins, Billie-Jo's foster father, provided a detailed account of the errands he had been running with his daughters. He described returning to the house to find Billie-Jo lying in the garden, an image that he claimed would haunt him forever. But as detectives delved deeper, cracks began to appear in his story. One of the earliest points of contention involved the exact timing of Sion's errands. Investigators worked to verify his account by speaking with shopkeepers and analyzing receipts, but the timeline was tighter than Sion had initially described. Forensic experts were called in to examine the clothing Sion had been wearing that day, searching for clues that could either corroborate or challenge his version of events. What they found would shift the focus of the investigation entirely. Microscopic droplets, invisible to the naked eye, were discovered on Sion's clothing. These droplets, identified through advanced forensic techniques, were consistent with what might be expected if someone had been in close proximity to Billie-Jo during the incident. Sion's legal team would later argue that these traces could have been transferred when he tried to assist her upon discovering her in the garden. But for investigators, the presence of these droplets raised difficult questions. Had Sion arrived moments after the crime, or had he been present when it occurred? As the forensic team worked to uncover answers, detectives began exploring other potential leads. Was there evidence of an intruder? Could someone have entered the property unnoticed and fled before the family returned? Officers canvassed the neighborhood, speaking to anyone who might have seen something unusual that day. Some neighbors reported hearing what sounded like shouting or loud noises in the garden, but no one could provide a definitive account of an outsider entering or leaving the property. The lack of physical evidence, pointing to an intruder, further complicated the investigation. In their search for answers, law enforcement also began to probe into the dynamics within the Jenkins household. As with any close family, there were complexities and tensions that investigators believed might shed light on the case. Friends of Billie-Jo described her as a vibrant and ambitious teenager who had faced her share of challenges growing up. They spoke of her artistic talent and her dreams of a brighter future, but some also hinted at a more strained relationship with Cyan. While these accounts were anecdotal and subjective, they fueled suspicions about what might have unfolded behind closed doors. Cyan's demeanor during the investigation added another layer of intrigue. To some, he appeared composed, cooperative, and genuinely distraught over Billie-Jo's death. But to others, his calmness seemed calculated, as though he were carefully managing how he was perceived. This dichotomy became a focal point for detectives, who studied every interaction and statement for potential clues. Was his behavior that of a grieving parent, or was it indicative of something more sinister? While the focus remained heavily on Cyan, the investigative team worked hard to ensure no avenue was overlooked. Forensic experts continued to analyze the scene, revisiting the garden for any overlooked evidence. The iron bench Billie-Jo had been painting was examined in detail, its surface revealing smudges and markings that might hint at a struggle. Paint supplies scattered near the scene were photographed and cataloged, each item a potential clue in a case that was as much about what wasn't there as what was. The media, too, played a significant role in shaping the public perception of the case. News outlets descended upon Hastings, their headlines sensationalizing every new development. Billie-Jo's face became a hauntingly familiar image, her bright smile contrasted with the somber details of her death. The Jenkins family found themselves under intense scrutiny, with reporters speculating about their private lives and motives. The pressure from the public and the press only heightened the urgency of the investigation. As days turned into weeks, the police faced a critical decision: whether to charge Cyan Jenkins. The evidence was circumstantial, but the forensic findings and inconsistencies in his account weighed heavily against him. Detectives knew that moving forward without solid proof risked jeopardizing the case, but waiting too long could allow public doubt to fester. It was a delicate balance, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Behind the scenes, legal teams prepared for what was shaping up to be a landmark case. Cyan maintained his innocence, his defense arguing that the evidence was insufficient and the focus on him misplaced. Meanwhile, the prosecution built a narrative centered on the forensic findings and the lack of evidence supporting the theory of an intruder. Both sides understood the importance of the case, not just for the Jenkins family, but for a community desperate for closure. As the legal proceedings loomed closer, the emotional toll of the case became increasingly apparent. Billie-Jo's friends and teachers spoke at vigils held in her honor, their words a reminder of the bright future that had been stolen from her. The community of Hastings grappled with the shock of the crime, their collective grief mingled with a growing desire for justice. The case had become more than a tragedy. It was now a symbol of the fragility of life and the importance of accountability. In the midst of it all, Billie-Jo's memory endured. Her artwork, saved by friends and family, became a testament to her creativity and passion. Photographs of her smiling face adorned the makeshift memorials that sprung up around Hastings, a reminder of the life that had been taken too soon. As the investigation pressed on, her story became a rallying cry for those seeking answers, a voice that demanded to be heard even in the silence left behind. As the jury entered the courtroom to deliver their verdict, the room was heavy with anticipation. Every seat was filled with members of the public, journalists, and those closest to Billie-Jo Jenkins. The months of testimony, forensic analysis, and emotional recounts had all led to this moment. The judge called the court to order, and all eyes turned to the foreperson of the jury. The silence was palpable as the verdict was read. Cyan Jenkins stood motionless, his face a mix of resolve and trepidation. The words "guilty of serious harm, resulting in death," rang through the courtroom, a culmination of the prosecution's relentless effort to tie him to the tragic events that had unfolded in the Jenkins family's backyard. Gasps rippled through the gallery, followed by murmurs of disbelief. For some, this decision was a step toward justice for Billie-Jo. For others, it raised more questions than answers. Jenkins' reaction was one of visible shock. His defense team immediately announced their intention to appeal, citing concerns about the evidence and the way it had been interpreted during the trial. But for the moment, the conviction stood, and Cyan was led away in handcuffs, his life forever changed. Outside the courthouse, the public reaction was a mix of relief and outrage. Supporters of Billie-Jo's memory gathered, holding signs demanding accountability and justice. Others, still unsure of Jenkins' guilt, expressed unease about the verdict. The media captured every angle, their cameras trained on the faces of those leaving the courtroom, searching for reactions that might convey the magnitude of what had just occurred. For Billie-Jo's friends and family, the verdict was bittersweet. The conviction didn't bring her back, nor did it erase the pain of losing her so young. But it did provide a sense of closure, however partial. Her teachers, classmates, and community members attended a candlelight vigil that evening, lighting flames in her memory and sharing stories of her bright spirit. As they spoke of her talent for painting, her infectious laugh, and her dreams for the future, the weight of her absence was felt all the more deeply. But the legal battle was far from over. Jenkins' legal team quickly filed an appeal, challenging key elements of the case. They argued that the forensic evidence, particularly the microscopic droplets, had been misinterpreted and that alternative explanations for their presence hadn't been adequately explored. They also pointed to procedural issues, claiming that the intense media coverage had biased the jury. The appeal process would take years, drawing out the pain for those seeking closure. During this time, forensic science itself was advancing. New methods of analysis emerged, allowing for a more nuanced understanding of the evidence that had been central to the prosecution's case. Jenkins' legal team pushed for this new technology to be applied, hoping it would cast doubt on the original findings. The court eventually granted their request, and experts re-examined the droplets with updated techniques. The results were inconclusive. While the new analysis didn't definitively exonerate Jenkins, it also failed to provide the level of certainty the original prosecution had relied upon. This ambiguity became a cornerstone of Jenkins' appeal, with his defense arguing that reasonable doubt had always existed. The case's complexity grew deeper, blurring the lines between guilt and innocence. Meanwhile, the public's perception of the case began to shift. Documentaries, podcasts, and news specials revisited the investigation, questioning whether justice had truly been served. Journalists interviewed neighbors, friends, and even members of the original investigative team, uncovering details that hadn't been widely known during the trial. Some described a rush to judgment, while others defended the integrity of the investigation. For the Jenkins family, the ongoing appeals were a double-edged sword. On one hand, they sought clarity and justice for Billie-Jo. On the other, the prolonged legal process kept their pain in the public eye, making it harder to heal. They struggled to reconcile their grief with the uncertainty surrounding the case, clinging to memories of Billie-Jo as a source of comfort. As the appeal moved forward, new witnesses came forward, adding to the complexity of the case. One individual claimed to have seen a stranger acting suspiciously near the Jenkins property on the day of the incident. While this account couldn't be definitively corroborated, it added a new layer of doubt to the original narrative. The defense seized upon this testimony, arguing that it supported their theory of an intruder. The prosecution, however, remained steadfast. They countered that the lack of physical evidence supporting the intruder theory made it implausible. They reminded the court of the original forensic findings and the timeline established during the trial, urging the judges to uphold the conviction. The appeal reached its conclusion in a tense courtroom setting. After months of deliberation, the judges announced their decision. Jenkins' conviction was overturned on the grounds of insufficient evidence. The announcement sent shockwaves through the legal community and the public at large. Jenkins was released from custody, but the ruling wasn't an exoneration. It was a recognition of the case's unresolved complexities. For Billie-Jo's community, the overturned conviction was a bitter pill to swallow. While some welcomed the decision as a triumph of justice, others felt it left Billie-Jo without the accountability she deserved. The case remained an open wound, a reminder of the fragility of life and the challenges of finding truth in the face of tragedy. As Jenkins walked free, he faced a world that had irrevocably changed. His name had become synonymous with one of the most contentious cases in recent history, and the question of his guilt or innocence continued to divide public opinion. For Billie-Jo's loved ones, the journey for justice wasn't over. It had merely shifted into a new, uncertain phase. The garden where Billie-Jo had once painted remained a somber reminder of the life lost there. Flowers and tributes continued to appear, placed by those who refused to let her memory fade. Her artwork, saved by her friends and family, became a symbol of her creativity and passion, a testament to the life she had hoped to build. The legacy of Billie-Jo Jenkins extended beyond the courtroom. Her story sparked conversations about the justice system, the reliability of forensic evidence, and the importance of transparency in high-profile cases. It served as a cautionary tale, a reminder that the pursuit of justice is rarely straightforward. As the community of Hastings tried to heal, They carried with them the memory of a vibrant young girl whose life had been tragically cut short. Her story, though filled with pain, became a beacon for change, inspiring efforts to ensure that such a tragedy could never happen again. Billie-Jo's voice, though silenced, continued to resonate, reminding everyone of the enduring power of love, hope, and the pursuit of truth. As Cyan Jenkins tried to piece together his life following his release, the weight of public scrutiny followed him like a shadow. Though his conviction had been overturned, the cloud of suspicion refused to lift. To many, he was still the central figure in a story that had left too many questions unanswered. His every move was watched, every statement dissected, and his name forever tied to a tragedy that had torn apart a family and captivated a nation. For Jenkins, the legal fight wasn't over. While he was now free, he sought to clear his name entirely. His legal team pushed for an official declaration of his innocence, arguing that the original investigation had been flawed and that Jenkins had suffered a miscarriage of justice. They pointed to the forensic evidence, which they claimed had been misinterpreted, and the alternative theories of an intruder, which they argued had been dismissed too quickly. The fight for exoneration was as much about reclaiming his reputation as it was about seeking vindication. Meanwhile, the memory of Billie-Jo Jenkins remained a focal point for her loved ones and the community in Hastings. Her friends and family organized events to honor her life, creating scholarships in her name and supporting causes she might have cared about. Her artwork was displayed in local galleries, a bittersweet reminder of her talent and potential. These efforts served as a way to keep her spirit alive, even as the case surrounding her death continued to unfold. The media, ever eager to reignite public interest, revisited the case with renewed vigor. Documentaries and news specials dissected every detail, presenting theories and revisiting evidence with the benefit of hindsight. Journalists interviewed former investigators, forensic experts, and even members of the Jenkins family, attempting to piece together a coherent narrative. But instead of bringing clarity, these efforts often deepened the sense of uncertainty. The public was left to grapple with conflicting perspectives, each as compelling as the other. For those closest to Billie-Jo, the ongoing focus on the case was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it kept her story alive and ensured that she wouldn't be forgotten. On the other, it made moving forward nearly impossible. The constant reminders of her loss, coupled with the lack of definitive answers, left an open wound that refused to heal. Her family found themselves caught between grief and the need for resolution, their lives forever changed by the events of that fateful day. As Jenkins pursued further legal avenues, new evidence began to emerge. Forensic advancements allowed investigators to revisit key pieces of evidence, including the microscopic droplets that had played such a pivotal role in his initial conviction. The new analysis suggested alternative interpretations that cast doubt on the original findings. These revelations added fuel to Jenkins' case, strengthening his claim that he had been wrongfully accused. At the same time, advocates for justice for Billie-Jo raised concerns about the focus on Jenkins' legal battles. They feared that the push for his exoneration risked overshadowing the ultimate goal, uncovering the truth about what had happened to Billie-Jo. For these advocates, the priority was ensuring that her case didn't slip into obscurity, even as the legal spotlight shifted. The emotional toll of the case extended far beyond the courtroom. For the community in Hastings, the case had left an indelible mark. Why? Parents worried for their children's safety, neighbors found themselves more guarded, and the once close-knit town became a place of whispers and suspicion. The impact of Billie-Jo's death rippled through every aspect of life, a stark reminder of the fragility of security and the devastating consequences of loss. As the years passed, the case remained unresolved. Jenkins' legal battles continued, but they became less about the specifics of the case and more about the broader questions it raised. How do we ensure justice is truly served? How do we balance the need for closure with the complexities of evidence and due process? And how do we honor the memory of a life cut short while grappling with the uncertainty of what happened? For Billie-Jo's family, these questions were deeply personal. They sought solace in the memories of her laughter, her creativity, and the joy she had brought into their lives. They worked tirelessly to ensure that her legacy would be one of light, not darkness, and that her story would inspire change rather than despair. In the broader context, Billie-Jo's case became a touchstone for conversations about forensic science, media influence, and the justice system. It highlighted the challenges of balancing public opinion with legal fairness and the need for continued advancements in forensic technology. Her story was taught in law schools and discussed in community forums, a testament to its enduring impact. But for those who had known her, Billie-Jo was not just a case or a cautionary tale. She was a vibrant, talented young girl with dreams and aspirations, a person who had touched the lives of everyone around her. Her loss was felt deeply, not just in Hastings, but across the nation, as her story resonated with people from all walks of life. As the legal battles continued and the public debate raged on, one thing remained constant: the memory of Billie-Jo Jenkins. Her life, though tragically short, left an indelible mark on the world. And for those who loved her, that memory was a source of strength and a reminder of the importance of seeking truth, no matter how difficult the path. The fight for justice, though fraught with challenges, was a testament to the enduring power of hope and the unwavering belief that her story mattered. As time marched forward, the fight for answers in Billie-Jo Jenkins' case took on new dimensions. Forensic science continued to evolve, and with it came the potential for breakthroughs that could finally bring clarity to one of Hastings' most haunting tragedies. Yet, the answers that everyone sought remained elusive, trapped in a maze of conflicting evidence, fading memories, and emotional wounds that refused to heal. Sion Jenkins, now a free man, but still under the shadow of suspicion, lived a life defined by two contrasting realities. On one hand, he had regained his physical freedom. On the other, his name and reputation were indelibly linked to the tragic events of that February afternoon in 1997. Every day was a reminder of the fragility of his newfound freedom. People still whispered, still speculated, and still divided themselves into camps, those who believed in his innocence and those who remained convinced of his guilt. Jenkins became a polarizing figure in the ongoing discourse surrounding the case. Some viewed him as a man wrongfully accused, someone who had endured years of imprisonment and legal battles for a crime he claimed he did not commit. Others saw him as someone who had escaped justice due to a lack of definitive evidence. For Jenkins, the public's perception was both a burden and a challenge, but he remained steadfast in his pursuit of a full exoneration. Meanwhile, the legal system quietly moved forward. The idea of reopening the investigation into Billie-Jo's case was discussed in hushed tones among advocates and law enforcement. The original detectives had long since retired, and the community had changed. But Billie-Jo's case remained a painful reminder of unfinished business, a chapter in Hastings' history that demanded resolution. As forensic techniques became more sophisticated, the possibility of reviewing old evidence brought a glimmer of hope. Experts began revisiting key pieces of evidence from the original case, using advanced technology to extract details that might have been missed decades earlier. The infamous microscopic droplets on Jenkins' clothing were once again analyzed, this time with methods far more precise than what had been available in the late 1990s. The findings from this new analysis were striking, but they did not lead to the definitive answers that everyone had hoped for. The data suggested several possible scenarios, none of which could be ruled out completely. While the evidence did not exonerate Jenkins outright, it also failed to firmly establish his guilt. Instead, it highlighted the complexities of the case and the limitations of both the investigation and the technology available at the time. For Billie-Jo's family, the lack of closure was a heavy burden. They had lost a daughter, a sister, and a friend, and the pain of that loss had never truly gone away. Vigils continued to be held in her honor, with the community coming together to remember her life and advocate for justice. Her friends, now adults with families of their own, spoke at these events, sharing memories of her laughter, her kindness, and her dreams of becoming an artist. Her presence was felt in every candle that was lit, every flower that was laid, and every story that was told. The media, ever eager for a new angle, revisited the case once again. Documentaries explored not just the crime itself, but the broader implications of the investigation and trial. Experts debated the merits of the evidence, while journalists dug into the human side of the story. Billie-Jo's life and the lives of those around her were laid bare, examined from every possible perspective. The narrative became less about finding definitive answers and more about understanding the impact of a tragedy that had touched so many lives. In the midst of this, a renewed call for transparency emerged. Advocates for justice argued that the investigation's findings, the trial proceedings, and the subsequent appeals should be made fully accessible to the public. They believed that by shedding light on the case, new insights might emerge and lessons could be learned to prevent similar tragedies in the future. While this effort faced resistance from some quarters, it gained significant traction, fueled by the unwavering determination of those who refused to let Billie-Jo's story fade into obscurity. The conversation surrounding Billie-Jo's case also extended to broader issues of justice and accountability. It became a catalyst for discussions about the role of forensic evidence in criminal investigations, the ethical responsibilities of law enforcement, and the ways in which the media can shape public perception. Her story was taught in legal and criminology courses, serving as a case study in the complexities of the justice system and the profound human cost of unresolved questions. For the Jenkins family, the years of scrutiny and heartbreak took their toll. While they had always maintained their innocence, the strain of being at the center of such a high-profile case left scars that would never fully heal. Their lives had been irrevocably altered, and the path to rebuilding was fraught with challenges. Yet, they found moments of solace in the small victories, acts of kindness from strangers, messages of support from those who believed in their innocence, and the enduring love of those who stood by them. As for Billie-Jo, her memory endured in the hearts of those who knew her, and even among those who had only come to know her through the case. Her artwork, preserved by her family, became a symbol of her creativity and resilience. Exhibitions were held in her honor, with proceeds supporting charities dedicated to helping vulnerable children. These events served as a reminder of the life she had lived and the potential that had been lost. In the end, Billie-Jo's story remained one of unanswered questions and enduring impact. The truth of what happened that February afternoon may never be fully known, but her legacy transcended the circumstances of her death. She became a symbol of the need for justice, the power of community, and the importance of remembering those who are lost too soon. Her story continued to inspire, to challenge, and to remind everyone that behind every headline is a human life, a family, and a community forever changed. On the crisp morning of June 18, 2001, Danielle Jones left her family home in East Tilbury, Essex, just like any other school day. At 15 years old, Danielle was full of life and plans, a teenager with a bright smile and an unmistakable spark. She had kissed her parents goodbye, slung her backpack over her shoulder, and stepped out the front door. No one in the house could have imagined that would be the last time they would ever see her. Danielle's route to school was a routine she had walked countless times before. It was short and familiar, taking her through a quiet residential area and along a stretch of road lined with neat rows of houses. That morning, the sky was clear, and a gentle breeze brushed against the trees. The world seemed peaceful, too peaceful to hint at the storm that was about to break. When Danielle failed to show up at her school, her teachers immediately noticed. She wasn't the kind of student who skipped classes or arrived late without a good reason. By mid-morning, the school had contacted her parents, who were immediately filled with a sense of unease. Their daughter wasn't the type to go off without telling anyone. Something felt wrong, terribly wrong. As the minutes stretched into hours, that initial unease deepened into panic. Danielle's parents called her friends, hoping someone might know where she was, but no one had seen her. They tried her cell phone, but the calls went unanswered. Her father drove along her usual route to school, stopping at every corner and calling out her name, but there was no trace of her. It was as though she had vanished into thin air. By the afternoon, the police were involved, and the small town of East Tilbury found itself at the center of an unfolding nightmare. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors and asking residents if they had seen anything unusual that morning. Some neighbors reported seeing Danielle walking toward the bus stop, but their accounts offered little insight into what might have happened next. There were no reports of suspicious vehicles or strangers in the area, no obvious signs that danger had been lurking in the shadows. As daylight began to fade, the search for Danielle intensified. Police officers combed through fields and parks, and volunteers from the community joined in, calling out her name and shining flashlights into every hidden corner. Her face, captured in a school photograph, began to appear on posters taped to lampposts and shop windows, the word "missing" printed in bold letters above her name. The sight of her bright smile on those posters was a gut-wrenching contrast to the fear that now gripped the town. The local police were meticulous in their efforts to trace Danielle's steps, but their investigation soon hit a troubling dead end. None of the CCTV cameras along her route had captured her that morning. It was as though she had simply vanished in the brief stretch between her home and the main road. This absence of evidence only deepened the mystery, leaving investigators to wonder, had Danielle been taken by someone she knew? Or had a stranger been waiting for her that morning, hidden just out of sight? Among the people questioned by the police was Stuart Campbell, Danielle's uncle by marriage. He lived nearby and had a history of being close to the family. At first, his demeanor appeared cooperative, even concerned. He told officers that he hadn't seen Danielle that morning, and express his hope that she would be found safe and sound. But as investigators delved deeper, subtle cracks began to form in his account. Campbell had been a doting uncle in the past, often showering Danielle with attention and gifts. To many, he seemed like a kind and generous man. But to those who looked closer, there was something unsettling about the way he interacted with her. Friends of Danielle later told police that she had mentioned feeling uncomfortable around him, though she never elaborated on why. These whispers of unease, combined with inconsistencies in Campbell's statements, began to shift the focus of the investigation. By the end of the first week, the case had taken on a grim urgency. Police publicly classified Danielle's disappearance as suspicious, a term that carried with it the weight of unspoken fears. Her family pleaded for her safe return in an emotional press conference, their voices breaking with desperation. But behind closed doors, detectives were beginning to fear the worst. As the investigation gained momentum, forensic teams descended on Campbell's home, searching for any clue that might link him to Danielle's disappearance. They examined his car, his phone records, and his computer, looking for even the smallest thread that might unravel the mystery. What they found was chilling. Messages sent from Danielle's phone after her disappearance were traced back to Campbell, raising questions about how he had gained access to her device. Even more damning were the traces of Danielle's DNA discovered in Campbell's car, a discovery that would prove impossible for him to explain. These revelations marked a turning point in the case. The evidence, though circumstantial, began to paint a disturbing picture of betrayal and deceit. Campbell was arrested and questioned, but he denied any involvement in Danielle's disappearance. His calm and measured responses only added to the unease, leaving investigators to wonder, was he telling the truth, or was he hiding something far darker? As days turned into weeks, the search for Danielle continued, but hope began to wane. Her face, once a symbol of optimism and vitality, became a haunting reminder of the fragile line between safety and danger. For her family, the pain of not knowing was almost unbearable. They clung to the possibility that she might still be alive, even as the evidence pointed toward a more sinister conclusion. By the end of the month, the town of East Tilbury had changed forever. What had once been a quiet, close-knit community was now a place of whispered fears and unanswered questions. And at the center of it all was a girl who had left her home one morning and never returned. A girl whose absence cast a long, dark shadow over everyone who knew her. The days following Danielle Jones's disappearance blurred into a relentless cycle of questions, searches, and haunting silences. The town of East Tilbury, once a haven of familiarity, now felt like a place fraught with suspicion. Each passing hour deepened the urgency, and as the search efforts continued, the focus of the investigation began to narrow. Detectives pored over every detail of Danielle's life, trying to construct a timeline. Friends, neighbors, teachers, and classmates were questioned. They described Danielle as vibrant and outgoing, but nothing in their accounts suggested she had planned to run away or leave her life behind. It became clear early on that her disappearance was not a matter of choice, but something far more troubling. Attention quickly shifted to Danielle's mobile phone, which had played an unsettling role in the investigation. Text messages had been sent from her number to friends and family after the time she was last seen, but something about them didn't sit right. The language in the messages didn't sound like Danielle. The tone was off, and phrases she never used were suddenly appearing. Her friends immediately flagged this to the authorities, and experts in digital forensics were called in to analyze the data. What they uncovered sent chills through the investigation team. The texts, which appeared to be attempts to make it seem as though Danielle was alive and communicating, were traced to a location disturbingly close to home, Stuart Campbell's property. This revelation turned the investigation sharply toward the man who had initially presented himself as a concerned relative. Suddenly, his calm demeanor and cooperative attitude took on a much more sinister undertone. The discovery of the texts was just the beginning. Investigators began digging deeper into Campbell's background, and what they found painted a deeply troubling picture. Stuart Campbell was no stranger to law enforcement. Though his past convictions weren't widely known at the time, a pattern of behavior began to emerge, one that showed a history of control, manipulation, and unhealthy fixation. He had a history of relationships marred by coercion and aggression, and there were whispers of inappropriate conduct that had never made it into official reports. But more than his past, it was Campbell's behavior in the present that raised alarm bells. His timeline on the day Danielle disappeared was riddled with inconsistencies. He claimed he hadn't seen Danielle that morning, yet his cell phone records placed him in the vicinity of her usual route to school. His explanations for these discrepancies were vague and evasive, further eroding the trust investigators initially had in him. While Campbell's behavior and background were deeply concerning, investigators needed more than suspicions to take decisive action. They began surveillance on him, watching his movements and interactions closely. During this time, officers noticed something that would later prove crucial. Campbell seemed preoccupied with his car. He washed it obsessively, far more than what would be considered normal. Forensic experts were called in to examine the vehicle, and what they found would shift the case into a new phase. Traces of Danielle's DNA were discovered inside Campbell's car. Though the samples were small, they were significant enough to raise serious questions. How had they gotten there? Why would there be evidence of Danielle in a vehicle she had no reason to be in? Campbell's explanations were vague and contradictory, and as the evidence against him mounted, his facade of innocence began to crumble. Even as these discoveries came to light, Campbell maintained his innocence. He insisted he had nothing to do with Danielle's disappearance, and that any evidence pointing to him was either coincidental or misinterpreted. His confidence was unnerving, and it forced investigators to tread carefully. The last thing they wanted was to make a misstep that could jeopardize their case. As the investigation zeroed in on Campbell, the emotional toll on Danielle's family became increasingly evident. Her parents, visibly drained from the weeks of uncertainty, appeared at press conferences, pleading for any information that could lead to their daughter's return. The stress of not knowing and the growing suspicion that someone they had trusted might be involved was almost too much to bear. Their heartbreak was mirrored in the community, where neighbors and friends struggled to reconcile the image of Stuart Campbell as a friendly, familiar face with the growing mountain of evidence against him. While the investigation built its case, the public began to take notice. News outlets picked up the story, and Danielle's disappearance became a national headline. Journalists descended on East Tilbury, turning the quiet town into the backdrop of a media frenzy. The added attention brought in new tips and witnesses, but it also amplified the pressure on investigators to act quickly and decisively. One of the most chilling pieces of evidence came in the form of Campbell's personal diary, discovered during a search of his home. The entries revealed a disturbing obsession with control and power, particularly over young women. While the diary did not mention Danielle by name, its contents painted a disturbing picture of a man who sought to dominate and manipulate those around him. This, combined with the forensic evidence and the suspicious behavior surrounding his car, was enough for authorities to make their move. Stuart Campbell was arrested on suspicion of Danielle's disappearance, and his home became the focal point of an exhaustive search. Forensic teams scoured every inch of the property, looking for any clue that might lead them to Danielle. The media captured images of officers carrying out bags of evidence, fueling public speculation about what had been found. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community, digging deeper into the while. For many, it was a moment of vindication, a sign that justice for Danielle might finally be within reach. But for others, it raised more questions than answers. If Campbell was responsible, why had he done it? And most haunting of all, where was Danielle? Despite Campbell's arrest, the search for Danielle continued. Officers expanded their efforts, exploring new areas and following up on tips that had come in since the case made national headlines. The lack of a body was a significant challenge for prosecutors, who knew they would need to build a case strong enough to withstand the absence of the most critical piece of evidence. As Campbell sat in custody, investigators worked tirelessly to connect the dots. Every detail, every inconsistency in his story, and every piece of forensic evidence became part of the puzzle they were assembling. The pressure was immense, but so was their determination. Danielle's family, her friends, and the entire community of East Tilbury deserved answers and justice. As the investigation into Danielle Jones's disappearance deepened, the focus remained squarely on Stuart Campbell. While he sat in custody, investigators pored over every piece of evidence they had gathered, each thread leading them closer to what they believed was the truth. The tension in East Tilbury was palpable, the quiet town gripped by the chilling possibility that one of their own had betrayed the trust of not only a family, but an entire community. The search of Campbell's property revealed several troubling findings. Among them were items that raised questions about his intentions and state of mind in the days leading up to Danielle's disappearance. Tucked away in a drawer, investigators discovered handwritten notes that, while not explicitly incriminating, painted a picture of a man grappling with dark and obsessive thoughts. These notes, combined with the entries in his diary, formed a portrait of someone whose mind was far from stable. One discovery in particular stood out. Forensic analysts examining Campbell's computer found evidence of internet searches and saved content that suggested an unhealthy fixation on younger individuals. This digital trail added weight to the growing theory that Campbell's actions on the morning of Danielle's disappearance were not random but premeditated. Investigators worked tirelessly to piece together the timeline, using every resource at their disposal to ensure no stone was left unturned. Meanwhile, the search for Danielle herself continued. Police expanded their efforts, combing through nearby fields, wooded areas, and abandoned buildings. Volunteers from the community joined in, driven by a desperate hope that Danielle might still be found alive. Each new day brought with it the cruel uncertainty of whether they were closer to answers or simply further prolonging the agony of not knowing. Back in the interrogation room, Campbell maintained his innocence. His calm demeanor during questioning was unnerving, his answers measured and deliberate. He denied any involvement in Danielle's disappearance and dismissed the evidence against him as circumstantial or misinterpreted. Yet, investigators couldn't ignore the inconsistencies in his statements or the mounting pile of evidence that suggested otherwise. The discovery of Danielle's DNA in Campbell's car remained one of the most damning pieces of evidence. Forensic experts testified that the likelihood of the DNA being present by chance was virtually impossible. Campbell's explanation for its presence, that Danielle had once been in the car for an entirely innocent reason, was weak and unconvincing. Investigators pressed him on this point, but he refused to waver from his story. As the weeks turned into months, the case against Campbell grew stronger. Witnesses came forward with accounts that added further weight to the prosecution's theory. One neighbor recalled seeing Campbell acting suspiciously near his home on the morning Danielle disappeared. Another described hearing what sounded like an argument coming from his property, though they couldn't be certain of the exact time. These statements, while not definitive proof, added to the tapestry of evidence that painted Campbell as the prime suspect. Despite the mounting case against him, one critical element remained missing: Danielle herself. The absence of her body posed a significant challenge for investigators and prosecutors alike. Without it, proving beyond a reasonable doubt that Campbell was responsible for her disappearance would be an uphill battle. Yet they pressed on, determined to secure justice for Danielle and her family. Public interest in the case showed no signs of waning. Media coverage intensified, with news outlets reporting every development and speculation running rampant. The community, once tight-knit and trusting, found itself divided. Some were convinced of Campbell's guilt, citing the overwhelming evidence against him. Others, unable to reconcile the image of the man they thought they knew with the heinous acts he was accused of, clung to the possibility of his innocence. Amid the chaos, Danielle's family continued to grieve and hope in equal measure. They held vigils, attended by hundreds of people, where candles were lit in Danielle's memory and prayers were said for her safe return. Her parents, though visibly exhausted and heartbroken, refused to give up. They spoke to the media, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. Their resilience in the face of unimaginable pain became a beacon of strength for the community. The legal proceedings against Campbell began to take shape as prosecutors prepared their case. The evidence, while largely circumstantial, was compelling. The DNA in his car, the suspicious text messages sent from Danielle's phone, the inconsistencies in his alibi, and his disturbing internet history all pointed to a calculated act of deception. Prosecutors knew they would need to present a narrative so airtight that even without a body, the jury would have no choice but to convict. As the case headed to court, the atmosphere in East Tilbury was tense. People whispered in coffee shops and on street corners, their conversations tinged with a mix of fear and anticipation. The prospect of a trial brought hope for answers, but also the sobering reality that Danielle might never be found. For many, the uncertainty was the hardest part, the not knowing, the endless questions that hung heavy in the air. Inside the courthouse, the proceedings began with opening statements that laid bare the stakes of the trial. Prosecutors painted a chilling picture of a man who had betrayed his family's trust in the most heinous way imaginable. They outlined the evidence, piece by piece, building a case that left little room for doubt. Campbell's defense, meanwhile, argued that the evidence was circumstantial and insufficient, that the investigation had been biased from the start. As witnesses took the stand, the courtroom was filled with a mix of emotions. Tears flowed as Danielle's parents recounted the morning she disappeared, their voices trembling with heartbreak. Forensic experts presented their findings with clinical precision, their testimony underscoring the gravity of the evidence against Campbell. The diary entries, the DNA, the text messages, All of it was laid bare for the jury to consider. Outside the courtroom, the public's fascination with the case only grew. People gathered in front of their televisions, following every twist and turn of the trial. Social media buzzed with theories and debates, the case becoming a national conversation about trust, betrayal, and justice. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the outcome would hinge on the jury's interpretation of the evidence. While the prosecution had built a compelling case, the defense's arguments about the lack of a body and the reliance on circumstantial evidence gave some jurors pause. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as both sides presented their closing arguments, each making a final plea for justice. For Danielle's family, the trial was both a step toward closure and a reminder of the immense loss they had suffered. They sat quietly in the gallery, holding on to one another, their faces a mix of hope and sorrow. As the jury was sent to deliberate, the weight of the past months hung heavy over everyone in the room. The questions that had haunted them from the beginning remained unanswered. What had happened to Danielle? And would justice finally be served? As the trial against Stuart Campbell moved forward, the courtroom became a battleground for evidence, emotion, and the pursuit of justice. Each day brought new revelations, and the gallery was filled with a mix of supporters, reporters, and spectators, all eager to witness the unfolding drama. For Danielle Jones' family, the proceedings were both an agonizing reminder of their loss and a crucial step toward closure. The prosecution's case was meticulous and unrelenting. Every piece of evidence, no matter how seemingly small, was presented with precision. Forensic experts took the stand to explain the significance of the DNA found in Campbell's car, the messages sent from Danielle's phone, and the timeline discrepancies in Campbell's account. Their testimonies painted a chilling picture of premeditation, leaving little room for doubt in the minds of those listening. One of the most compelling moments came when prosecutors revealed the results of a deep dive into Campbell's phone records. The data showed that his phone had been active near Danielle's route to school on the morning of her disappearance, contradicting his initial claim that he had been home the entire time. This revelation was accompanied by a series of text messages sent from Danielle's phone, which forensic linguists testified bore signs of being written by someone else. The language and tone were inconsistent with Danielle's usual style, further implicating Campbell in the crime. The defense, however, fought back with vigor. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial and could not definitively link Campbell to Danielle's disappearance. They pointed to the absence of a body as a significant gap in the prosecution's case, suggesting that without concrete proof of what had happened to Danielle, the charges against Campbell were based on speculation. It was a bold strategy, but one that resonated with some observers who questioned whether the case was airtight. As the trial progressed, attention turned to Campbell's character. Witnesses who had once been close to him were called to testify, offering glimpses into his life and behavior. Former colleagues described him as charming, but controlling, someone who liked to exert power over those around him. Friends of Danielle's family spoke of uneasy interactions they had witnessed between Campbell and Danielle, moments that now took on a sinister light in retrospect. Perhaps the most harrowing testimony came from Danielle's parents, who recounted the days leading up to her disappearance with heartbreaking clarity. Their pain was palpable as they described the morning she left for school, the growing fear as hours turned into days, and the devastating realization that she might never come home. Their words left a lasting impression on everyone in the courtroom, a stark reminder of the human cost of the tragedy. Outside the courtroom, the trial dominated headlines. Reporters camped outside, broadcasting updates to a captivated public. Social media buzzed with theories and debates, the case becoming a national conversation about trust, betrayal, and the limits of the justice system. The spotlight on the trial brought renewed attention to Danielle's story, but it also placed immense pressure on the prosecution to secure a conviction. As the prosecution neared the end of their case, they presented one final piece of evidence: surveillance footage from a gas station near Campbell's home, taken on the morning Danielle disappeared. The footage showed Campbell's car passing by at a time when he claimed to have been at home. While the video was grainy and did not capture Danielle, its implications were clear. It placed Campbell near the scene of her disappearance and further undermined his alibi. In their closing arguments, the prosecution laid out their case with unwavering conviction. They asked the jury to consider the weight of the evidence: the DNA in Campbell's car, the suspicious text messages, the inconsistencies in his timeline, and his history of manipulative behavior. They argued that, while the absence of a body was tragic, it did not diminish the strength of the case against Campbell. Danielle, they said, deserve justice, and it was the jury's responsibility to deliver it. The defense, in their final plea, urged the jury to focus on the gaps in the prosecution's case. They highlighted the lack of direct evidence tying Campbell to Danielle's disappearance and questioned the reliability of the forensic finding. They painted Campbell as a man caught in a web of circumstantial evidence and media speculation, a scapegoat in a case that had captured the nation's attention. As the jury retired to deliberate, the atmosphere in the courtroom was heavy with tension. Danielle's family sat quietly, holding hands and bracing themselves for whatever was to come. The weight of the past months hung heavy over them, a relentless reminder of the daughter they had lost and the questions that still remained unanswered. Outside, the public waited anxiously for a verdict. The trial had become more than just a legal proceeding. It was a reflection of the community's collective grief and desire for justice. People gathered outside the courthouse, their faces a mix of hope and apprehension, as the hours stretched into days. For the investigators who had worked tirelessly on the case, the trial was the culmination of months of effort and determination. They knew the challenges of securing a conviction without a body, but they also believed in the strength of their case. The evidence, while circumstantial, formed a compelling narrative of guilt, one that they hoped the jury would see as clearly as they did. Back in the deliberation room, the jury grappled with the complexities of the case. The evidence was overwhelming, but the absence of definitive proof weighed heavily on their minds. They debated late into the night, examining every detail and considering the implications of their decision. It was a responsibility they did not take lightly, knowing that their verdict would shape the course of countless lives. As the deliberations continued, the nation held its breath, waiting for the moment that would determine the outcome of one of the most harrowing cases in recent memory. For Danielle's family, the wait was agonizing, each passing moment a painful reminder of the daughter they had lost. And for the community of East Tilbury, the trial was a stark reminder of the fragility of trust and the enduring impact of tragedy. The courtroom fell silent as the jury filed back in, their expressions giving away nothing. The air was thick with anticipation, and every eye was on the foreperson as they handed the slip of paper containing the verdict to the judge. For Danielle Jones' family, the moment felt suspended in time, a culmination of months of anguish and unanswered questions. Stuart Campbell sat motionless at the defense table, his face a mask of calm that betrayed nothing of the storm surrounding him. As the judge began to read the verdict, the words hung heavy in the air. Guilty, guilty. The jury had found Stuart Campbell guilty of abducting and taking the life of Danielle Jones. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, followed by a mixture of relief and quiet sobs from Danielle's loved ones. The decision brought with it a measure of justice, but it was far from closure. Danielle's body remained missing, and with it, a piece of the puzzle that would never be fully resolved. The judge wasted no time in delivering the sentence. Stuart Campbell was sentenced to life in prison, a punishment that reflected the gravity of the crime and the devastating impact it had on Danielle's family and the community. As the judge spoke, they made it clear that Campbell's actions were an unforgivable betrayal of trust, a calculated act that had robbed a young girl of her future and shattered the lives of those who loved her. For the prosecution, the verdict was a hard-fought victory. The case had been one of the most challenging they had ever faced, built largely on circumstantial evidence and the tireless work of investigators who refused to give up. The DNA evidence, the inconsistencies in Campbell's timeline, the suspicious messages sent from Danielle's phone, all of it had come together to form a compelling narrative that the jury could not ignore. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered to hear the verdict. When news of the guilty verdict spread, a wave of emotion swept through the crowd. For many, it was a moment of vindication, proof that justice could prevail, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. But for others, it was a sobering reminder of the tragedy that had brought them all there, a young girl whose life had been cut short and whose final moments remained a haunting mystery. As the news spread, media outlets broadcast the verdict across the country, sparking conversations about trust, accountability, and the resilience of those left behind. The case had captured the nation's attention not just because of its shocking nature, but because it spoke to deeper fears and questions about the people we think we know. Stuart Campbell had been a trusted family member, someone who was supposed to protect Danielle, not harm her. The betrayal at the heart of the case struck a chord with people everywhere, leaving many to wonder how such darkness could exist beneath the surface of everyday life. For Danielle's family, the verdict brought a measure of relief, but little solace. Their daughter was still gone, and the man who had taken her refused to reveal where she was. The courtroom victory was a step toward justice, but it did little to fill the void left by Danielle's absence. Her parents issued a statement to the press, thanking the community for their support and urging anyone with information about Danielle's whereabouts to come forward. Their plea was a heartbreaking reminder that, even with a guilty verdict, their journey for answers was far from over. Meanwhile, Stuart Campbell began his life behind bars, his fate sealed by the weight of the evidence against him. Yet, even in prison, he maintained his innocence, refusing to provide any information about Danielle's final moments or where she might be. His silence was a cruel final act, a refusal to grant the closure that Danielle's family so desperately needed. For investigators, his refusal to cooperate was a source of frustration and anger, a reminder of the limitations of justice when faced with someone so unrepentant. In the years that followed, the case continued to resonate. Its impact felt far beyond the borders of East Tilbury. Danielle's story became a symbol of the importance of vigilance and the need for communities to look out for one another. Her parents turned their grief into advocacy, working to raise awareness about the warning signs of predatory behavior and the importance of early intervention. Their efforts inspired countless others to take action, ensuring that Danielle's legacy would live on in the lives of those she touched. The community of East Tilbury, forever changed by the tragedy, found ways to heal and move forward. Vigils were held in Danielle's memory, her name becoming a rallying cry for hope and justice. The case prompted discussions about the importance of safeguarding young people and the need for systemic changes to prevent similar tragedies. Schools implemented new safety measures, and local organizations dedicated themselves to creating a safer environment for children. Even as the years passed, the search for Danielle's body continued. Her family, undeterred by the lack of progress, worked with private investigators and search teams, following every lead and exploring every possibility. They refused to give up hope, believing that one day they would find the answers they sought. Their determination was a testament to the enduring power of love and the unbreakable bond between parent and child. For those who followed the case, Danielle's story remained a haunting reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of justice. It was a story of betrayal and loss, but also one of resilience and strength. It spoke to the darkest corners of human nature, but also to the light that can emerge in the face of unimaginable pain. And while the questions surrounding Danielle's final moments may never be fully answered, her memory lives on, a beacon of hope and a call to action for all who hear her story. In the aftermath of Stuart Campbell's conviction, life in East Tilbury carried an undeniable heaviness. The town had become synonymous with a tragedy that resonated far beyond its borders, a tragedy that left its mark on every corner of the community. Danielle Jones' disappearance had shattered the sense of safety and trust that had once defined the small town. Now, the streets were quieter, the laughter of children less frequent, as families held their loved ones closer. For Danielle's parents, the verdict was both a resolution and a haunting reminder of the battle still ahead. Campbell's refusal to disclose the location of Danielle's remains meant that her parents were denied the closure of laying their daughter to rest. Every day brought a new wave of anguish as they faced the harsh reality that, despite Campbell being behind bars, their fight for answers was far from over. Determined to bring Danielle home, her family refused to let the case go cold. They worked tirelessly with private investigators and search teams, continuing the effort to locate Danielle's remains. Search parties combed through fields, forests, and rivers, driven by the faint hope that one day they might find what they were looking for. These efforts were supported by the community, who rallied behind Danielle's family with unwavering solidarity. Though the searches often ended in disappointment, each effort was a testament to the enduring love of a family unwilling to give up. Meanwhile, Campbell's silence became a focal point of public outrage. His decision not to reveal Danielle's whereabouts was seen as a cruel act of defiance, a final way to exert control over a family he had already devastated. Advocacy groups began pushing for legal reforms, calling for harsher penalties for individuals who withhold the location of their victims. These campaigns gained momentum, spurred by cases like Danielle's, where families were left in limbo, unable to properly grieve. Inside prison, Campbell lived a life of isolation, shunned by both fellow inmates and the outside world. His refusal to cooperate with authorities further solidified his reputation as a man devoid of remorse. Despite the evidence that had convicted him, he continued to maintain his innocence, a claim that rang hollow in the face of the overwhelming case against him. His silence only deepened the public's disdain, casting him as a figure of contempt in the eyes of those who followed the case. The community of East Tilbury, though forever changed, found ways to move forward. Vigils were held annually in Danielle's honor, bringing together residents who shared memories and pledged to keep her legacy alive. Her story became a cautionary tale for parents and educators, sparking discussions about safety and the importance of vigilance. Schools in the area implemented new programs focused on awareness and prevention, determined to protect their students from ever facing a similar fate. Nationally, Danielle's case became a catalyst for change. Advocacy groups and lawmakers worked together to draft new legislation aimed at improving protections for children and holding perpetrators accountable. These efforts culminate in the passing of laws that imposed stricter penalties on those who refuse to cooperate in investigations involving missing persons. Though these changes came too late to help Danielle's family, they served as a lasting tribute to her memory and a commitment to preventing future tragedies. For Danielle's parents, the years that followed were marked by a relentless search for peace. They turned their grief into action, dedicating their lives to raising awareness about the dangers that had claimed their daughter. They spoke at schools and community events, sharing Danielle's story and emphasizing the importance of trust and vigilance. Their advocacy work touched countless lives, transforming their loss into a powerful force for change. Despite the passage of time, the pain of Danielle's absence never faded. Her family held on to her memory with unwavering devotion, surrounding themselves with photographs, letters, and mementos that captured her vibrant spirit. Her bedroom remained untouched, a sacred space filled with reminders of the life she had lived and the dreams she had yet to fulfill. Though the ache of her loss was ever present, it was accompanied by a fierce determination to honor her legacy. For those who had followed the case from the beginning, Danielle's story remained a haunting reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of justice. It was a story that highlighted both the darkest corners of human behavior and the resilience of those left behind. While the questions surrounding her disappearance and final moments might never be fully answered, her impact was undeniable. Danielle's name became a symbol of hope, a call to action, and a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable pain, love and determination can shine through. Years later, the town of East Tilbury stood as a testament to the enduring strength of a community, united by grief and hope. Danielle's memory lived on in the hearts of those who knew her, and in the lives of those touched by her story. Her family, though forever marked by their loss, continued their advocacy work, ensuring that her legacy would inspire change for generations to come. The world might never know the full truth of what happened to Danielle, but her story remains a beacon of resilience, a reminder that even in the face of darkness, the human spirit has the power to endure, to fight, and to heal. And while her family may never find all the answers they seek, their love for Danielle will forever be a guiding light, a force that transcends time and loss. On a chilly November evening in 2000, the streets of Leeds were cloaked in the soft glow of streetlights as twilight descended over the city. 16-year-old Leanne Tiernan walked alongside her best friend, Sarah, their laughter filling the crisp air as they carried their shopping bags. The pair had spent the afternoon at the bustling Kirkgate Market, a vibrant hub filled with vendors, chatter, and the smell of fresh pastries. It was a typical day for two teenagers, carefree and immersed in the excitement of the upcoming holiday season. As they approached a fork in the road near Huffley Gill, a wooded pathway cutting through the outskirts of the neighborhood, Leanne and Sarah prepared to part ways. Sarah lived just a short walk away, while Leanne's route would take her through the quiet residential streets leading to her home. They exchanged cheerful goodbyes, completely unaware that this would be the last time Sarah would ever see her friend alive. Leanne adjusted her scarf against the growing chill and stepped into the shadows of the path ahead. The area, though peaceful, had an eerie stillness to it that night. The distant hum of traffic faded with each step she took, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the faint creak of tree branches swaying in the wind. It was the kind of quiet that normally brought a sense of calm, but tonight it felt different, heavy, almost foreboding. Minutes passed, and as the light from the street lamps grew faint, Leanne's silhouette melted into the darkness. She clutched her shopping bag tightly, the rhythm of her boots crunching against the gravel path steady and deliberate. Then, as she approached a bend in the trail, something shifted, a presence, subtle but unmistakable. Her steps faltered, her heart quickening as she scanned the dense tree line for movement. But the shadows betrayed nothing. Suddenly, a sharp noise broke the silence, a snap, like a twig underfoot. Leanne froze, her breath hitching in her throat. She spun around, her eyes wide, searching for the source. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response. Just the wind carrying with it the faint smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. She tried to convince herself it was nothing. A stray cat, perhaps, or a deer moving through the underbrush. But then, before she could take another step, she felt it. A hand clamped tightly over her mouth, yanking her backward into the suffocating grip of the unknown. Her shopping bag fell to the ground with a muffled thud, its contents spilling across the dirt. "Ah!" She struggled, kicking and thrashing, her muffled cries lost in the emptiness around her. The attacker's grip was unyielding, dragging her further into the shadows where the path disappeared into the trees. Back at home, Leanne's family grew concerned as the hours ticked by. She was known for her punctuality and had promised to be back well before dinner. Her mother, alarmed by the silence, tried calling her phone, but the line went straight to voicemail. Panic began to set in as the realization hit. This wasn't like Leanne. Something was wrong. By midnight, the family had reported her missing to the police. Officers arrived swiftly, combing through the initial details of her disappearance. Sarah's account of their parting near Houghly Gill became the focal point, and search teams were quickly dispatched to the area. Volunteers from the community joined in, armed with flashlights and an unshakable determination to find the missing teenager. As the search intensified, the scene at Houghly Gill took on an almost surreal quality. The cold night air was filled with the distant shouts of searchers calling Lynn's name, their voices echoing through the woods. Officers moved methodically, shining their lights into every crevice, every patch of undergrowth that might conceal a clue. But the hours passed with no sign of Leanne. The next morning, daylight revealed the stark reality of the situation. Scattered along the trail were fragments of her belongings, a single earring, a crumpled receipt, and the shopping bag she'd been carrying. These items, while heart-wrenching, offered the first tangible evidence that Leanne had been there. Yet, they also raised chilling questions. Where had she gone? And who had taken her? The discovery galvanized the investigation. Forensic teams descended on the scene, meticulously cataloging every piece of evidence. The items were bagged and sent to the lab, where they would be analyzed for traces of DNA or fingerprints. Meanwhile, officers expanded their search radius, knocking on doors and interviewing anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual that night. Leeds, a city known for its tight-knit communities, was shaken to its core. Parents clung to their children a little tighter, and neighbors exchanged uneasy glances as whispers of fear spread. The media picked up the story, broadcasting Leanne's smiling face across the nation and urging anyone with information to come forward. Tips began to pour in, but most led to dead ends, only adding to the growing frustration of investigators. As the days turned into weeks, the trail grew colder. The woods, once alive with the buzz of search efforts, now stood silent, a haunting reminder of the unanswered questions that lingered in the air. For Leanne's family, the absence was unbearable. Her mother, a pillar of strength amidst the chaos, held on to hope with an iron grip, refusing to entertain the possibility that her daughter might never come home. But even as hope persisted, a darker reality loomed. Somewhere out there, someone knew what had happened to Leanne. Someone had been lurking in the shadows that night, watching, waiting, and ultimately striking with chilling precision. The question was no longer just about finding Leanne. It was about stopping whoever had taken her before they could strike again. And as the investigation pushed forward, the quiet streets of Leeds braced themselves for the revelations yet to come. On a chilly November evening in 2000, the streets of Leeds were cloaked in the soft glow of streetlights as twilight descended over the city. 16-year-old Leanne Tiernan walked alongside her best friend, Sarah, their laughter filling the crisp air as they carried their shopping bag. The pair had spent the afternoon at the bustling Kirkgate Market, a vibrant hub filled with vendors, chatter, and the smell of fresh pastries. It was a typical day for two teenagers, carefree and immersed in the excitement of the upcoming holiday season. As they approached a fork in the road near Houghly Gill, a wooded pathway cutting through the outskirts of the neighborhood, Leanne and Sarah prepared to part ways. Sarah lived just a short walk away, while Leanne's route would take her through the quiet residential streets leading to her home. They exchanged cheerful goodbyes, completely unaware that this would be the last time Sarah would ever see her friend alive. Leanne adjusted her scarf against the growing chill and stepped into the shadows of the path ahead. The area, though peaceful, had an eerie stillness to it that night. The distant hum of traffic faded with each step she took, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the faint creak of tree branches swaying in the wind. It was the kind of quiet that normally brought a sense of calm, but tonight it felt different, heavy, almost foreboding. Minutes passed, and as the light from the street lamps grew faint, Leanne's silhouette melted into the darkness. She clutched her shopping bag tightly, the rhythm of her boots crunching against the gravel path steady and deliberate. Then, As she approached a bend in the trail, something shifted, a presence, subtle but unmistakable. Her steps faltered, her heart quickening as she scanned the dense tree line for movement. But the shadows betrayed nothing. Suddenly, a sharp noise broke the silence, a snap, like a twig underfoot. Leanne froze, her breath hitching in her throat. She spun around, her eyes wide, searching for the source. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response. Just the wind, carrying with it the faint smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, a stray cat perhaps, or a deer moving through the underbrush. But then before she could take another step, she felt it. A hand clamped tightly over her mouth, yanking her backward into the suffocating grip of the unknown. Her shopping bag fell to the ground with a muffled thud, its contents spilling across the dirt. She struggled, kicking and thrashing, her muffled cries lost in the emptiness around her. The attacker's grip was unyielding, dragging her further into the shadows where the path disappeared into the trees. Back at home, Leanne's family grew concerned as the hours ticked by. She was known for her punctuality and had promised to be back well before dinner. Her mother, alarmed by the silence, tried calling her phone, but the line went straight to voicemail. Panic began to set in as the realization hit. This wasn't like Leanne. Something was wrong. By midnight, the family had reported her missing to the police. Officers arrived swiftly, combing through the initial details of her disappearance. Sarah's account of their parting near Huffley Gill became the focal point, and search teams were quickly dispatched to the area. Volunteers from the community joined in, armed with flashlights and an unshakable determination to find the missing teenager. As the search intensified, the scene at Huffley Gill took on an almost surreal quality. The cold night air was filled with the distant shouts of searchers calling Leanne's name, their voices echoing through the woods. Officers moved methodically, shining their lights into every crevice, every patch of undergrowth that might conceal a clue. But the hours passed with no sign of Leanne. The next morning, daylight revealed the stark reality of the situation. Scattered along the trail were fragments of her belongings, a single earring, a crumpled receipt, and the shopping bag she'd been carrying. These items, while heart-wrenching, offered the first tangible evidence that Leanne had been there. Yet they also raised chilling questions. Where had she gone? And who had taken her? The discovery galvanized the investigation. Forensic teams descended on the scene, meticulously cataloging every piece of evidence. The items were bagged and sent to the lab, where they would be analyzed for traces of DNA or fingerprints. Meanwhile, officers expanded their search radius, knocking on doors and interviewing anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual that night. Leeds, a city known for its tight-knit communities, was shaken to its core. Parents clung to their children a little tighter, and neighbors exchanged uneasy glances as whispers of fear spread. The media picked up the story, broadcasting Leanne's smiling face across the nation and urging anyone with information to come forward. Tips began to pour in, but most led to dead ends, only adding to the growing frustration of investigators. As the days turned into weeks, the trail grew colder. The woods, once alive with the buzz of search efforts, now stood silent, a haunting reminder of the unanswered questions that lingered in the air. For Leanne's family, the absence was unbearable. Her mother, a pillar of strength amidst the chaos, held on to hope with an iron grip, refusing to entertain the possibility that her daughter might never come home. But even as hope persisted, a darker reality loomed. Somewhere out there, someone knew what had happened to Leanne. Someone had been lurking in the shadows that night, watching, waiting, and ultimately striking with chilling precision. The question was no longer just about finding Leanne. It was about stopping whoever had taken her before they could strike again. And as the investigation pushed forward, the quiet streets of Leeds braced themselves for the revelations yet to come. As the first rays of sunlight pierced through the dense canopy of Huffley Gill, the search teams prepared for another long day of combing through the woods. The discovery of Leanne's shopping bag and scattered belongings had intensified the urgency of the operation, but it also deepened the sense of dread among the searchers. Somewhere in these woods lay the answers they sought, yet each passing hour without finding Leanne seemed to push those answers further out of reach. Detectives leading the investigation began to re-examine every detail of Leanne's routine that day, hoping to uncover anything they might have overlooked. The timeline was clear. She had left the market with her friend Sarah, parted ways near the edge of the woods, and vanished into the shadows. But what happened in the moments after she stepped onto that secluded path? The absence of witnesses and the quiet nature of the area made this question maddeningly difficult to answer. The search expanded beyond Huffley Gill, as officers began canvassing nearby neighborhoods. They knocked on doors, showing Leanne's photograph to residents, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual on the night she disappeared. Most responses were sympathetic but unhelpful. People expressed shock and concern, but had little to offer in the way of concrete leads. One elderly woman mentioned hearing a faint scream late in the evening, but couldn't pinpoint the direction it had come from. It was a fragment of information, but it only added to the growing puzzle. Meanwhile, forensic teams analyzed the items recovered from the scene. The shopping bag, torn and muddied, yielded no immediate clues. However, a faint smudge on the receipt found nearby caught the attention of one examiner. Under a high-powered microscope, they identified what appeared to be a partial fingerprint. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a tiny thread that could potentially unravel the mystery. As the investigation unfolded, the media coverage grew more intense. News crews swarmed the area, their cameras capturing the determined faces of searchers and the tearful pleas of Leanne's parents. The public responded in kind, flooding police hotlines with tips and theories. Some leads were plausible, pointing to suspicious vehicles or individuals seen in the area. Others were less credible, fueled by paranoia and speculation. Detectives sifted through them all, aware that even the most unlikely tip could hold the key to cracking the case. Among the tips was a particularly chilling report from a local resident who claimed to have seen a man acting suspiciously near Hoffley Gill in the days leading up to Leanne's disappearance. The witness described him as middle-aged, with a stocky build and a menacing demeanor. He had been loitering near the entrance to the woods, watching passers-by with unsettling intensity. While the description was vague, it gave investigators a potential lead to pursue. Composite sketches were created based on the witness's account and distributed to the public. The image of the suspect, with his cold, piercing eyes and shadowed features, quickly became synonymous with the case. Flyers bearing his likeness were posted on every lamppost, bus stop, and shop window in the area, urging anyone with information to come forward. As days turned into weeks, the search for Leanne continued relentlessly. The wooded area of Hoffley Gill became a grim battleground where hope and despair collided. Search dogs, trained to detect human scent, were brought in to assist, their handlers guiding them through every nook and cranny of the terrain. The dogs sniffed intently at the ground, their ears perked, their movements purposeful. But even their keen senses seemed to come up empty, the dense undergrowth concealing its secrets with an almost taunting resolve. Despite the lack of progress, the police refused to relent. They revisited the initial witness reports, piecing together a timeline that might explain how Leanne had been taken without anyone noticing. The narrow path she had walked was flanked by thick trees and uneven ground, making it easy for someone to hide undetected. It was the perfect place for an ambush, a fact that made the investigators' blood run cold. Attention also turned to individuals in the area who had prior criminal records, particularly those involving similar crimes. Officers reviewed case files, looking for patterns or behaviors that might suggest a connection to Leanne's disappearance. This led them to a list of potential suspects, each one more troubling than the last. One name in particular stood out, a man with a history of stalking and intimidation. He had lived near Hoffley Gill for years, but had recently moved away under mysterious circumstances. The timing was too coincidental to ignore. With this new lead in hand, detectives began to dig deeper into the man's background. They visited his former neighbors, piecing together a portrait of someone who had always been regarded as off. He kept to himself, they said, but there was something unnerving about the way he watched people, especially women and young girls. One neighbor recalled an incident where he had been seen pacing near the woods late at night, muttering to himself. Another mentioned seeing him carrying heavy bags into the woods, though they hadn't thought much of it at the time. As these accounts surfaced, the pressure on investigators mounted. They knew they were racing against the clock, not just to find Leanne, but to prevent the possibility of another victim. Every moment felt like a missed opportunity, every dead end a bitter reminder of the stakes involved. And through it all, Leanne's family waited, clinging to the hope that their daughter would be found alive. The investigation reached a fever pitch when a breakthrough occurred. Forensic analysts, using advanced techniques, managed to extract DNA from one of the items found near the scene. The sample was run through the national database, and within days, they had a match. It was a name that sent chills down the spines of the detectives, a man with a criminal record that matched the profile they had been building. With this new lead, the hunt for answers took a decisive turn. But as investigators prepared to close in on their suspect, the weight of the case hung heavy over them. They knew that even if they found the man responsible, the question of Leanne's fate would remain unanswered until she was brought home. And as the sun set over Leeds once more, the quiet streets braced for the storm yet to come. The pressure inside the station reached a boiling point as the investigation against John Taylor intensified. Detectives meticulously combed through every shred of evidence they had gathered, determined to solidify their case against him. Each piece, from the duct tape to the buried containers, pointed unmistakably in his direction. But despite the overwhelming weight of the evidence, Taylor remained maddeningly evasive. He refused to admit any involvement, maintaining a stance of stubborn denial that left investigators seething with frustration. Outside the walls of the interrogation room, the forensic teams were making steady progress. An in-depth analysis of the fibers found on Leanne's clothing revealed a match to materials recovered from Taylor's home. The connection was irrefutable, a damning link that tied him directly to her disappearance. But the forensic discoveries didn't stop there. Specialists examining the soundproofed room in Taylor's basement found traces of DNA on the restraints. Traces that, while degraded, bore striking similarities to Leanne's genetic profile. It was a grim but critical breakthrough that added yet another layer of evidence to the growing case. As the evidence mounted, detectives devised a new strategy for the interrogation. They knew Taylor was a man who thrived on control, someone who took pleasure in manipulating those around him. His refusal to cooperate wasn't just about protecting himself, it was about maintaining that control. So the investigators decided to turn the tables, using his own psychology against him. They carefully crafted a narrative, presenting the evidence not as a list of accusations, but as a puzzle they needed his help to solve. Taylor, intrigued despite himself, began to engage more actively. He questioned the detectives' theories, offering counterpoints that, while intended to deflect suspicion, inadvertently revealed details he had previously withheld. It was a delicate game of cat and mouse, with the detectives walking a fine line between provoking Taylor and pushing him too far. But their patience paid off when he slipped, referencing a detail about the wooded area where Leanne's belongings had been found, something that had never been made public. The room fell silent as the weight of Taylor's words hung in the air. The detectives exchanged a glance, their unspoken understanding confirming what they already suspected. Taylor knew more than he was letting on. They pressed him further, carefully steering the conversation without tipping their hand. Taylor, perhaps realizing his mistake, attempted to backtrack, but it was too late. The investigators had what they needed, a crack in his armor that they could exploit. Meanwhile, the search for Leanne's remains continued with renewed vigor. Armed with the information gleaned from Taylor's slip-up, search teams focused their efforts on a remote section of Holly Gill that had previously been overlooked. The area was dense with overgrowth, its uneven terrain making it difficult to navigate. But the searchers were undeterred, driven by the hope that they might finally bring Leanne home. Days of painstaking effort yielded a heartbreaking discovery. Hidden beneath a shallow layer of earth, wrapped in plastic and bound with duct tape, were the remains of Leanne Tiernan. The recovery was met with a wave of sorrow and relief, a bittersweet moment that brought an end to months of uncertainty but confirmed the unimaginable. Leanne's family, who had clung to hope even as the odds grew slim, were devastated by the news. Their grief was palpable, a raw and unfiltered pain that resonated with everyone involved in the case. The forensic examination of Leanne's remains provided further evidence against Taylor. The bindings matched the materials found in his possession, and traces of his DNA were discovered on the tape used to secure the plastic wrapping. It was the final nail in the coffin, a conclusive link that left no room for doubt about his involvement. Back in the interrogation room, the atmosphere had shifted. Taylor, once defiant and composed, now appeared visibly shaken. The detectives presented him with the latest findings, laying out the evidence with clinical precision. Taylor's attempts to deny his involvement grew increasingly desperate, his excuses unraveling under the weight of the facts. But even as he faltered, he refused to confess, clinging stubbornly to his facade of innocence. The lack of a confession was a bitter pill for the investigators to swallow. They had built an airtight case, one that would undoubtedly secure a conviction in court, but the absence of a direct admission from Taylor left a lingering sense of incompleteness. It was a reminder of the cruelty that defined him, his refusal to give Leanne's family the closure they so desperately needed. As the case moved toward trial, the community of Leeds rallied around Leanne's family. Vigils were held in her honor, with hundreds of residents gathering to light candles and share memories of the vibrant young girl whose life had been cut tragically short. The streets were lined with flowers, cards, and photographs, a collective outpouring of grief that underscored the depth of the loss. Leanne's parents, though consumed by their own sorrow, found strength in the support of their community. They vowed to see the case through to its conclusion, determined to ensure that Taylor would face justice for his actions. Their resilience became a beacon of hope, a testament to the enduring power of love in the face of unimaginable tragedy. As preparations for the trial began, the case against Taylor became a rallying point for discussions about safety and justice. Advocacy groups called for stricter penalties for offenders and greater resources for preventing similar crimes in the future. The story of Leanne Tiernan resonated far beyond Leeds, touching the hearts of people across the nation who recognized the fragility of life and the importance of protecting the vulnerable. The stage was set for a trial that would not only hold Taylor accountable, but also serve as a testament to the determination of those who had fought tirelessly for the truth. And as the legal proceedings loomed, the community braced itself for the emotional journey ahead, knowing that the fight for justice was far from over. The courtroom was packed with tension as the trial of John Taylor began. Journalists filled the gallery, their notebooks poised to capture every detail, while members of the public gathered outside, their whispers echoing the collective demand for justice. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation as the judge entered, signaling the beginning of what would be a grueling and emotional journey toward accountability. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case, methodically presenting the evidence that had been gathered over months of investigation. Each piece was a thread in a tapestry that painted Taylor as a calculating and remorseless individual. The forensic evidence, from the DNA found on the bindings to the materials recovered at his home, was presented with cold precision. Experts took the stand one by one, explaining how the fibers, hair samples, and other physical evidence all pointed to Taylor's direct involvement. The lead prosecutor's voice carried through the courtroom with unwavering conviction as they described the timeline of events leading to Leanne Tiernan's tragic end. They spoke of the calculated manner in which Taylor had waited, watching and choosing the moment to strike. The jury listened intently, their expressions somber as they absorbed the weight of the evidence. It was clear that this case was not just about proving guilt, it was about telling Leanne's story, ensuring that her voice was heard even in her absence. Taylor's defense team, meanwhile, sought to cast doubt on the prosecution's narrative. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that there were gaps in the timeline that left room for reasonable doubt. They painted Taylor as a misunderstood individual, claiming that the materials found in his home were innocuous, items that could be found in any household. But their arguments rang hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence, their attempts to humanize Taylor overshadowed by the chilling reality of his actions. One of the most harrowing moments of the trial came when Leanne's mother took the stand. Her voice trembled as she described her daughter, her bright smile, her kindness, her dreams for the future. She recounted the agony of the months spent searching, the sleepless nights filled with worry and fear. Her words were a powerful reminder of the human cost of Taylor's actions, a poignant contrast to the sterile evidence presented by the forensic experts. As the trial progressed, Taylor's demeanor became a focal point. He sat expressionless, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him, rarely looking up even as damning evidence was presented. This lack of emotion only served to deepen the jury's perception of him as cold and unrepentant. When he did speak, it was to deny any involvement, his voice devoid of remorse. His claims of innocence, however, were undermined by the sheer weight of the evidence against him. The prosecution's final argument was a masterclass in persuasion. They wove together the threads of the case, presenting a narrative that left no room for doubt. They spoke of the planning, the execution, and the aftermath of Taylor's actions, emphasizing the impact on Leanne's family and the community. They urged the jury to consider not just the evidence, but the moral responsibility they carried in ensuring justice was served. The jury's deliberation was tense, but relatively swift. After hours that felt like days, they returned to the courtroom, their expressions solemn. The foreperson stood, delivering the verdict that everyone had been waiting for, guilty on all counts. The words hung in the air, a moment of catharsis for those who had fought tirelessly for this outcome. As the verdict was read, Taylor remained impassive, his expression betraying no hint of emotion. But in the gallery, the impact was immediate. Leanne's family clung to one another, their tears a mixture of relief and sorrow. The community, too, felt a collective release, a sense that justice had finally been achieved. But even as the courtroom erupted in quiet murmurs, there was an unspoken understanding that the pain of Leanne's loss could never truly be erased. The sentencing hearing followed soon after, with the judge delivering a scathing rebuke of Taylor's actions. They spoke of the calculated nature of his crimes, the irreparable harm he had caused, and the need to protect society from individuals like him. The sentence was life imprisonment, with no possibility of parole, a decision that was met with quiet nods of approval from those in attendance. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere was one of somber reflection. Reporters delivered their updates to a captivated audience, their words underscoring the significance of the trial's outcome. Community members gathered to offer their condolences to Leanne's family, their presence a testament to the strength of collective grief and support. Leanne's parents, though still grieving, found solace in the knowledge that justice had been served. They spoke to the press, expressing their gratitude to the investigators, prosecutors, and community members who had stood by them throughout the ordeal. Their strength and resilience became an inspiration, a reminder of the power of love and determination in the face of unimaginable loss. As the case faded from the headlines, its impact lingered. Advocacy groups used Leanne's story to push for greater awareness of personal safety and the importance of community vigilance. Her name became synonymous with the fight for justice, a legacy that ensured she would never be forgotten. And for those who had been touched by her story, there was a renewed sense of purpose, a commitment to honoring her memory by standing up against the darkness that had taken her away. Leanne's light, though extinguished far too soon, continued to shine in the hearts of those who loved her, a beacon of hope in a world forever changed by her loss. As the courtroom doors closed on John Taylor's sentencing, the weight of the trial lingered in the air like a storm that had passed, but left destruction in its wake. For Leanne Tiernan's family, the verdict and sentence marked the end of a long and excruciating chapter, but it was not the conclusion they had hoped for. Justice had been served, but it could never bring back the daughter they had lost. Outside the courthouse, reporters continued their coverage, reflecting the sentiments of a community that had been both shaken and united by the tragedy. In the days following the trial, Leeds began to heal, though the scars of the case would remain visible for years to come. The wooded trails of Hopefully Gill, once a peaceful refuge for walkers and joggers, had become a symbol of both danger and resilience. Flowers and memorials were left near the spot where Leanne's belongings had been found, a quiet tribute to a young girl whose life had been stolen too soon. Her story had touched countless lives, not just in her hometown but across the nation, sparking conversations about safety, community vigilance, and the measures needed to protect others from similar fates. The investigation into Taylor's past didn't stop with the trial. Authorities worked to uncover whether Leanne had been his only victim or if his crimes extended beyond what was known. They pored over cold case files, looking for patterns that might link Taylor to other disappearances or unresolved crimes. While no direct connections emerged, the effort underscored the lasting impact of his actions. Taylor's incarceration brought a measure of relief, but it also served as a stark reminder of the potential for evil lurking beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary lives. Leanne's family channeled their grief into advocacy, determined to turn their tragedy into a force for good. They worked closely with local organizations to promote awareness of personal safety and to push for stronger legislation aimed at preventing crimes like the one that had claimed their daughter. Their efforts resonated with others who had experienced similar losses, creating a network of support and activism that gave their pain a sense of purpose. One of the most impactful outcomes of their advocacy was the establishment of a scholarship fund in Leanne's name. The fund aimed to support young people in the Leeds area who demonstrated the kindness and determination that Leanne had been known for. Each year, the scholarship recipients were invited to meet with her family, sharing their stories and aspirations. It was a bittersweet endeavor, one that brought moments of joy and connection, even as it underscored the absence of the person whose memory it honored. As time went on, the story of Leanne Tiernan became a case study for law enforcement and criminology students, a chilling example of the importance of thorough investigation and community involvement. Lectures and seminars dissected every aspect of the case, from the initial search efforts to the forensic breakthroughs that had ultimately secured Taylor's conviction. Her story became a teaching tool, a legacy that ensured her loss would not be in vain. The media also played a role in keeping Leanne's memory alive. Documentaries and true crime programs revisited the case, delving into the details of the investigation and its broader implications. While some feared that such attention might sensationalize her story, her family viewed it as an opportunity to remind the world of the vibrant, caring person Leanne had been. They participated in interviews and panel discussions, sharing their journey with honesty and courage. But even as the public interest in the case waned over time, those closest to Leanne continued to feel her absence in the quiet moments of their lives. Her family held on to the memories that defined her, not the headlines or the courtroom proceedings, but the small, everyday joys that had made her who she was. The sound of her laughter, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her dreams, the warmth of her presence, these were the things they carried with them, the things that no tragedy could ever take away. For the community of Leeds, the lessons of Leanne's story remained deeply ingrained. Neighborhood watch programs saw an increase in participation, and local authorities implemented new measures to ensure the safety of public spaces. The wooded paths of Holly Gill, once shrouded in fear, were gradually reclaimed by residents who refused to let the darkness of the past define their future. They walked those trails not in ignorance of what had happened, but in defiance of it, a collective act of resilience and remembrance. In the end, the story of Leanne Tiernan was not just one of loss, but of the strength and compassion that emerged in its aftermath. It was a story of a family's unyielding love, a community's unwavering support, and a justice system's determination to hold the guilty accountable. While her absence would always be felt, her legacy served as a reminder of the light that can emerge even in the darkest of times. As the seasons changed and years passed, Leanne's name became a symbol of hope and perseverance. Her memory lived on in the lives she had touched and the changes her story had inspired. And though the world continued to move forward, the impact of her life and her loss remained etched in the hearts of those who carried her story with them, a testament to the enduring power of love and the human spirit. If these stories of young lives stolen too soon left you reflecting on the fragility of trust and innocence, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the strange, dark, and mysterious. Turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. How can we create safer environments for the most vulnerable in our communities? Thank you for watching, and remember, every life has value, and every story deserves to be told. Stay safe, stay curious, and we'll see you in the next story.